Good morning, everyone. I'm Perrin Beatty, President and CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and I want to extend a warm welcome to all of you who are joining us today for our Executive Summit on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. On behalf of the Canadian Chamber, I'd like to begin today's event by recognizing that we're gathered on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, who've lived on and who've cared for these lands for millennia. We offer this acknowledgement to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improving relationships between nations in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Well, let's turn to the topic of today's event. Here at the Canadian Chamber, we know that growth can best be achieved by ensuring that people from all economic sectors, all regions, and all backgrounds and abilities can take part in and benefit from a healthy, innovative economy. This means creating diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplaces where individual differences and the contributions of all employees are recognized and valued. Having this sort of an environment fosters creative thinking, innovation, and problem solving, providing organizations and the country itself a competitive advantage. Increasing diversity and inclusion is the right thing to do in and of itself, but the economic argument for it is equally strong. DEI is both essential to promoting fairness of opportunity, business competitiveness, economic growth, and our nation's prosperity. So in today's discussions, we'll explore the state of diversity, equity, and inclusion in corporate Canada, and we'll look at the different ways in which the private sector is making progress and moving from awareness to action. Our sessions promise to be both insightful and timely. Without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first session, which is a fireside chat with our special guest, the Honourable Ahmed Hussen, who's the Minister of Housing and Diversity and Inclusion. A passionate advocate for his community, Minister Hussen has proudly represented the residents of York South-Weston since 2015. Before he started in politics, the minister worked at the grassroots level with neighbours and allies to create local solutions to local problems. This would lead the minister to helping secure $500 million to revitalize Toronto's Regent Park in 2006. Now, Minister Hussen is a firm believer that diversity is a fact and inclusion is a choice. During his time as the national president of the Canadian Somali Congress, he worked with national and regional authorities to advocate on important issues for Canadians of Somali heritage, which helped foster better civic engagement and integration. Now, having lived in social housing himself, Canada's first dedicated housing minister understands the positive impact of having an affordable, reliable place to live. He's focused on ensuring that everyone in Canada has a safe and affordable place to call home. We're extremely fortunate that Minister Hussen could join us today. Minister, welcome. We're delighted to have you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Honourable Beatty, and it is a pleasure to be here with you. I'm joining all of you virtually from Ottawa, which is on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples. Thank you to the Canadian Chamber of Commerce for hosting this really important discussion. In my time in public life, I have always believed that Canada, when you look at Canada, diversity is a fact in Canada. But inclusion is a choice, and I believe conversations and events like this help us to always remember to work towards better outcomes in terms of diversity, equity, and particularly inclusion of everyone in our society. As you said, Perrin, not only is diversity, equity, and inclusion the right thing to do, it's also the smart thing to do economically. When everyone is engaged in our economy, we do better collectively. We do better as a community, as a society, and as a country. And I can tell you that one of the interesting things about a diverse country that strives towards inclusion is that, and I'll use an analogy or an example of an institution, whether it's a hospital or a university or any institution. Imagine that institution only serving one group of people with one language and one gender and one economic or socioeconomic background. That institution doesn't have to innovate or try harder to meet the requirements of other diverse people. But imagine the same institution now has to serve a population that speaks, 24 languages and has different backgrounds and different cultural and other experiences. It's harder, yes, in the beginning, but through that effort of making sure that they serve everyone, in that process, that institution becomes more resilient. It becomes more nimble. It becomes more innovative. And as a country and as a society, the more inclusive we are, the more we strive for diversity, equity, and inclusion, the stronger and more resilient we'll become. And in the world today, you've seen all around us the importance, once again, we're being reminded of institutions, of those guardians of our way of life that are under attack everywhere. And so the winning countries in the global competition for investment and for innovation and for knowledge will be the countries that will be leaders in diversity, equity, and inclusion, because those countries will not only be more welcoming, but they will be more resilient as a result of having to step up to meet the needs of people from various backgrounds and various languages. So it is a pleasure for me to join you, and I really look forward to the fireside chat so we can have a more back and forth discussion. But pleasure to be here. Merci beaucoup tout le monde.
Minister, thank you so much for those opening remarks. And I would simply underscore the point that you make, that we're strengthened. Our diversity is a source of strength. It's not a source of weakness in Canada. And wherever I go in the world and I meet people from other countries, they hold Canada up as an example of the best that can happen when people come together, bringing their own talent, their own background, and their own perspectives, and build something that's more than the sum of the parts. So we are extremely fortunate to have the diversity that we have in Canada, but too often we leave people's skills sitting there unused and we don't have them fully involved. You personally bring a great deal to this discussion because you're the first Somali Canadian to hold a federal cabinet position. And you have firsthand experience with the challenges that many immigrants face when arriving in Canada. As you look back over your experience, what are some of the changes that you see concerning the state of diversity, equity, and inclusion in our country? How have we changed? How have we evolved over the course of the period that you've been here?
Well, first of all, it gives me great pleasure once again to be here. I am also the first person born in Africa to hold a cabinet position, at least someone from ethnically from Africa. And I think that in and of itself was a great signal to the more than 1 million Africans in Canada that they're also part of our representation in various bodies. And I think we all bring our own life experiences and our own socioeconomic backgrounds to these tables. And one of the things that I have noticed, and I'm very proud that governments are doing this now, is that we're talking to everyone. We're talking to Canadians. We're talking to communities that had never been engaged before. And when I use the word never, I mean it. I'm not using it carelessly. I'm deliberately saying there are communities in this country that simply had never been engaged by any level of government on policy making. And that has changed. That has changed so much now that we take it for granted that communities should be consulted on policies that affect them. And in fact, that you make better policies in Ottawa by talking to Canadians, by leaving Ottawa and going to various communities and engaging them and tapping into that really untapped source of cultural and societal wealth and competence that simply doesn't exist outside those communities. And so if you look at, for example, the things that we've been able to do with the Black Canadian community from coast to coast to coast, in all its diversity, we've been able to get it right because we've started to really listen to them in terms of making sure that we are doing the kinds of things that they have asked us to do. For example, Black Canadian communities in Canada had been asking for years that the federal government should go beyond program funding and that they should go towards core funding and funding for infrastructure and capacity building of Black Canadian nonprofits and charities. Well, we finally listened, and we listened because we engaged those communities. An example, there's a church in St. Catharines, Ontario, that used to be frequented by Harriet Tubman and her contemporaries. That church was falling apart, and because of the investments for infrastructure for Black Canadian organizations, that church has been saved not only for Black Canadian communities, but for Canadian history and for Canadian prosperity into the future. So I think those are the kinds of things that have changed, whether it is looking at immigration, whether it is making sure that our diplomatic corps looks like Canada, whether it is signaling a willingness to do the work necessary to diversify our amazing public civil service. Those are the kinds of things that I think are beginning to be done, and those conversations, not only were the activities not done before, those conversations were simply not happening in the past.
So we've evolved and we've improved over the time that you've been here. Much of this has been in the public sector, many of the things that you were citing. How about the private sector? How would you rate the performance of the private sector when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion?
I think the private sector has a mixed record. They've made a lot of progress on gender and including women, not just in the workforce, but in terms of making some serious progress in terms of bringing more women to senior executive positions, but also on boards, on corporate boards. And I believe that is as a result of, a push by government, but also a push within the private sector to do better. I believe that our investments and the establishment of a national system of early learning and childcare for affordable, high quality childcare has resulted in hundreds of thousands of women going back into the workforce. And today we have the highest participation of working age women in our economy in Canadian history, over 85%. And I don't think it's a coincidence that those numbers are beginning to show when childcare fees are being cut and more spaces are being created because of our investments. And I knew that would happen when I was working on the policy and I was selling it to provinces and territories. But to actually see it happen faster than it was scheduled is I think a really good bonus. For example, Manitoba hit $10 a day childcare by January 2023. Years before the actual deadline. And in Ontario, which was the last province to sign, you're seeing a 50% reduction in fees and more increase in spaces. So I think we've made a lot of progress. I think we've also made a huge amount of progress in reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. Today, we have tables between the federal government and all distinctions-based national Indigenous organizations on housing, on child welfare, on justice, on economic development, critical minerals, resource co-management, you name it. There's been a huge amount of progress, and even the most objective experts have said that more things have happened on the reconciliation agenda in the last 7 years than in the last 30 years combined. I think where we need to do more and to do better is to bring racialized Canadians in to our workforce, into our leadership, and into our conversations. It simply is not happening to the extent that it should. And when that is raised, a lot of times the response is that, well, at least we're not as bad as the Americans. Well, that is not good enough for me. And I think we need to have a serious conversation in this country about, for example, the fact that, I'll give you a very simple example. Between 2003 to 2013, the number of Black males in Canada in federal prisons jumped by 84%. That is a scandalous figure. And if you look at what mandatory minimum sentences have done, particularly to Black and Indigenous peoples, the overrepresentation, if you look at the number of, the disproportionate number of homeless individuals, the City of London has The City of London's population constitutes, First Nations constitute 3% of London, the City of London's population, but constitute 30% of its homeless population. That level of disproportionality shows that there's something wrong.
I think we have lost the minister. Can I ask the Canadian Chamber staff to see if we can reestablish the connection there? Okay, we apologize to all of our viewers who are with us today. There's been a breakdown in terms of the link to the minister. We're trying to reestablish that right now and to bring him back as rapidly as possible. Deanna, why don't we take a 5-minute pause and then come back in 5 minutes?
Yes, we'll do that. Yes.
Sorry, I had some technical issues, so I had to log back in. I apologize.
Minister, welcome back. We're and again, we apologize to the viewers for the delay, but we're delighted to have you back. The answer that you were giving leads us to the obvious next question, and that's that you've stated, as I mentioned during the introduction, you've stated that diversity is a fact and inclusion is a choice.
Yes.
What do we need to do to build a more equal and inclusive Canada?
I think we need to include people in institutions. We need to make sure that all Canadians have access to jobs and professions. We need to get into hard to reach communities, get into those neighborhoods, and ensure that people have access to mentorship, to educational remedial programs. One of the best things that I was engaged in Regent Park was a program called Pathways to Education. This is such an amazing program that basically the program filled all the gaps that low-income students were experiencing. So in other words, it's not just about the tutoring, it's about the bus fare, it's about the school lunch. We have to make sure that we invest in people and we invest in communities. And that we reimagine government services to make sure that those who have the least amount of voices, who also coincidentally tend to have the highest needs, don't tend to have the highest levels of advocacy. So how can we rearrange government programs so that they're more accessible, but also more impactful? So I'll give you an example. The Canada Child Benefit is meant to go to families with children. Well, if you're a single mom or single parent with kids and you don't file your income taxes, and you have kids, you don't get the Canada Child Benefit. And you may be in great need for the Canada Child Benefit. So what we need to do is make that connection and encourage people to file their income taxes. So in my time previously as Minister for Families, Children and Social Development, I increased a program that the government has, which is to engage thousands of community intermediaries to encourage people to file their income taxes. to encourage people to apply for their old age security and the guaranteed income supplement, and so on and so forth. One of the things that used to really bother me is that every year we would get hundreds of millions of dollars back as a government in benefits that should not be coming back to us. And there were people out there who needed them, people who tended to be, for the most part, racialized. And so we have to do better in terms of delivering those government services. And the way to do it is to hire and engage those intermediaries. So we had over 4,000 community intermediaries who would go to these hard-to-reach communities, including on reservations, and enable people to file their taxes, enable people to access the benefits that they desperately needed, so that the government of Canada would get less and less of that money back. The second thing that we need to do is we need to leverage the knowledge and human connections that our diaspora communities have with the rest of the world. For example, the continent of Africa has the highest return on investment of any emerging market. Yet Canada's trade and investment is very low compared to other countries. We are a trading nation. Our prosperity is connected to trade. We have a relatively smaller population compared to other major powers. And so we don't have a critical mass of people in Canada to establish a local market, such as in places like India or even the United States. So our prosperity is directly connected to trade and engagement with the rest of the world. But to do engagement, you have to physically be there. And guess what? Our national carrier, Air Canada, goes to only one city in Africa, Casablanca. 54 countries, doesn't go to Nairobi, doesn't go to Cairo, doesn't go to Johannesburg, goes to one city. We have to be there. We have to engage people, and we have to tap into the hundreds of languages and communities that are in Canada from diaspora communities. And we have to tap into them to enable us to access markets in their homelands. And they're more than willing to help because they want Canada to succeed, because Canada has given them a second chance, as it has for me. And so when you look at why newcomers give back so much to Canada, is because they appreciate the welcoming nature of Canadians. They appreciate the supports that we give to Canadians to new Canadians to succeed. We give people the tools that are necessary to succeed and contribute. What we don't do beyond that, which we should, is to engage newcomers to enable us to access markets for Canadian goods and services. We have a lot to offer. We have superior infrastructure compared to other countries. We have made tremendous investments in clean technology that is needed in places like Nigeria that still struggle to electrify the entire country. And so we have a lot to offer the world. And the government has built bridges in terms of through free trade agreements that are very progressive, that have allowed us to access markets to the tune of 1.5 billion people around the world. But we need to do a better job at really harnessing the power of diversity, equity, and inclusion by including communities in our agenda for trade and prosperity. And we will succeed together if we do that.
Minister, sadly, we're out of time, but we couldn't have had a better person to set the stage for today's discussion. It's been an enormous pleasure, and we're very grateful to you for being able to join us today. Thank you for the discussion, for taking the time to share your thoughts with us and your insights, and for your tireless work on behalf of all Canadians. We're most grateful to you.
Thank you very much.
For our audience, we're going to dive right into our next session. So for now, I'll turn things over to our Senior Vice President of Policy and Government Relations, Matthew Holmes, to kick off our second fireside chat of the day. Matthew, over to you.
Well, thanks so much, Perrin, and good morning to all. Very happy to be here with you today and looking forward to another excellent fireside chat that's up next. It's always a tall order to follow up on a conversation like the one we had. Always a pleasure to listen to Minister Hussen share some of his experience and insights, and and a great discussion between Perrin and the minister. So a tough act to follow for us, but I actually know with great certainty that our next guest is going to make it quite easy on us and easy on me as the question asker. It's my pleasure to introduce Sandra Odendahl, Senior Vice President and Head of Sustainability and Diversity with BDC, the Business Development Bank of Canada. A trailblazer in sustainable finance, Sandra is a respected and well-known voice in promoting sustainability and clean capitalism in Canada. She's previously led enterprise-level sustainability, community investment, and social finance programs and strategies at both Scotiabank and RBC, and currently leads all facets of BDC's sustainability and ESG strategy and programs, including the bank's renewed, enhanced focus on the environment, as well as its diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. Sandra, welcome, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks very much for inviting me, and you're absolutely right. That will be a tough act to follow, but I'm still delighted to have the opportunity to speak to you today, Matthew, and to join this event.
Great. Well, thanks again, and I'm looking forward to it as well. So, I think as we all know, for DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, to work, it has to be meaningful. It has to have meaning, and there has to be conviction behind it. So can you tell me, Sandra, how did you start being interested in DEI, and how has your journey into the DEI space been to date?
Yeah, well, thanks for the question. I think, I mean, I'm going to tell you, I guess, a little bit about myself, and maybe that'll give you a sense of why this matters to me. So in some ways, I think I always took diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, before we called it that, for granted. So I'm a first-generation Canadian. My dad is German, from Berlin. My mom was from Martinique in the French West Indies. I grew up in Ottawa, you know, in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and, you know, not the most diverse town in those days, with a pretty typical, you know, first-generation child of immigrants experience. So what that means is I heard at least 3 different languages at home, had relatives with a wide range of skin colors, backgrounds, and accents. You know, and of course, being the firstborn child of immigrants, my parents made it clear to me that I was going to be a doctor or a lawyer. Mm-hmm. And if that fell apart, maybe I could be an accountant or an engineer as backups. But definitely sort of have lived the immigrant and person of color experience. I guess the other thing, in terms of background and what sort of shaped my interest in this area, is I was also really used to being the only and the first. I was the only Black or mixed race kid in my grade school, and actually through most of high school. I've certainly had the experience of having racial taunts hurled at me by random kids on the playground when I was younger. What was really interesting, and I think has also shaped my view and also made me interested in how other people experience being different and the desire for inclusion, is that, in those days, like, I'm a Gen Xer, and my parents' view was the keep calm and carry on school of thought. So, when you went home and said to your parents, somebody was mean to me on the playground, I can still remember my father with his thick German accent saying, "Sandra, those children are idiots. You can't worry about idiots.
And he was right, probably. Yeah.
Focus on your schoolwork. One day you'll be their boss." He literally would say something like that, and that was the end of it. So it was, there was a bit of a suck it up and carry on perspective. So I would also say I was definitely the only Black kid at Saturday German lessons. And one of very few women in engineering school, often the only female on project teams and fieldwork trips. So I think, honestly, I actually became pretty comfortable with the experience of being the different one. But once I started my career, I got particularly interested, the first part of my career, in finding ways to support women in STEM and women in engineering. So that was sort of my, initially my passion was less about racial diversity and more about some of what I saw were some of the gender diversity challenges that exist today, but certainly needed work. So, I tutored math to high school kids, and maybe because I was a female engineer at the time, most of my students were girls, and also have and continue to volunteer for mentoring events at high school and my alma maters at universities, because I do believe strongly that if you see it, you can be it. And I do think that to the extent that people from different backgrounds, different cultures, different genders are visible in the workplace, in positions, in politics, it actually absolutely has a huge impact on young people feeling confident that they belong in that area as well. And I would say that in more recent years, I got much more interested in, have been a lot more active in working to address a broader range of DEI challenges. And I actually think it started for me just a few years ago. It really started after the murder of George Floyd, when I was working, I was running the social impact and sustainability team at one of Canada's big banks, and put up my hand to lead a task force to look at, how good was our diversity and anti-racism strategy and what should we do, and really looked at it across not just being an HR issue, but what does this look like in the workplace, but also in the marketplace? And what does this look like in the way that we interact with suppliers and how we show up for our clients? And, what can we do more? What can we do better? What should we be doing more of in the community? That was a real eye-opener, listening to diverse people's experiences, hearing about the challenges and the opportunities of making everybody feel like they're being treated fairly and that they're being inclusive and that there's a place for them. It was a huge conversation. I know it happened in a lot of different organizations, but for me, it was a real turning point in terms of realizing that, there's the chin up, keep calm and carry on school of thought from maybe the 70s and 80s. But really, there's a huge range of ways that people who are different, air quotes, experience life in a huge range of ways that people view those who they perceive as different. And a lot of work for all of us to do, regardless of what our background is, to consciously, be inclusive. So now my team at BDC is, has the 3 pillars really. It's sustainability, which technically does include social issues like diversity, but we've carved out enterprise diversity as a separate unit. And then the largest part of my team is actually strategic partnerships. And what we're doing with that is that we're partnering with organizations that work in diverse communities so that BDC is able to extend our reach in a thoughtful way to diverse entrepreneurs in those communities, because BDC is the bank for entrepreneurs. We finance and advise and invest in Canada's small and medium-sized businesses, and we recognize that diverse entrepreneurs often struggle with unique challenges to start and build their businesses. So what our goal is to make sure that we're supporting entrepreneurs from different backgrounds, different cultures, and from a range of diverse groups, so that Canada's entrepreneurial ecosystem is more reflective of the diversity of the country. So,
Right.
I mean, that's
Right.
been my journey up till today.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, it matters, and it's so great to make it personal, to hear your personal journey. And in that classic sense of leadership, as someone who is a first mover, is someone out in front, I think, and the minister spoke to this as well, how important it is for people from racialized communities, and even as a father of 2 young girls, for women to see themselves and opportunities. So the role that you've played in kind of embracing what could have been a very oppositional and you know, a very negative experience that you described early on, and embracing that and making that part of your role as a leader is really important. So thanks for sharing that. So we know that working to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion in all spaces is the right thing to do, but we also know that there's a robust business case. And the Minister Hussen said, I think his quote was, "It's the smart thing to do economically." And so given your role at BDC and the entrepreneurs you work with that you just mentioned, why do you think DEI is so important for Canadian businesses and to Canadian businesses right now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. And I think it's something that is a particularly important question for, you know, companies that are more in the small and medium-sized business space who may not feel that their interests are always represented when we have, you know, very high aspirational goals around DE&I, and you're in a, you know, a small independent business, you're just trying to make a go of it. What does this have to do with me? Or how do I, maybe even if you know what it has to do with you, it's how do I operationalize this? So the first step, of course, to your question is, you know, why should we be getting behind this to whatever extent we can? And I think there's really 3 or 4 good reasons. And as the minister said, yeah, it is actually good for the bottom line. And there's some solid research out there showing that companies that have like gender and ethnic diversity actually consistently deliver better on innovation, revenue, profits, and employee retention. In fact, there's some McKinsey data that's fairly recent that found that gender diverse companies are 15% more likely to outperform the market in their sector than non-gender diverse companies, and ethnically diverse companies are 35% more likely to outperform their peers. So I think the bottom line is the bottom line, and there's obviously, I think, a lot of reasons behind it are different ways of thinking, different perspectives, different worldviews can come together and really create some really robust and rich innovative thinking in any organization. And it's hard to argue that that's a bad thing, and the data backs that up. I think the second reason, which is obviously all of things feed into the bottom line, but more specifically, I think it's about talent. Companies' values more than ever really matter to employees. And right now we're in a really tight job market. Hiring is a very top concern for employers. We're hearing about, all sorts of things, conscious quitting. I don't know, there's all these different terms, quiet quitting. But the bottom line is that in this tight job market, employees are leaving their current workplaces in favor of ones that align better with their values. And again, there's data backing this up. One study that we looked at was from this year, KPMG found that almost half of employees say that they want their employer to demonstrate a commitment to environmental, social, and governance, like basically ESG, good corporate practice. And 1 in 5 of them actually have turned down job offers because they weren't satisfied, not with the pay, but with the company's reputation on those fronts, which is actually a lot of people. Again, tight job market. If you want to attract talent, showing that you're on top of this stuff is really important. The third reason is customers. So again, we just did a study on ESG and the supply chain, and we found that over 80% of large buyers, when you think about the supply chain, if you're trying to sell to large companies, they're going to be asking questions about what are you doing on a variety of environmental and social issues. And in fact, many of large companies are planning to, whatever they're asking today, 75% of them that we surveyed said they're planning to ask more on environmental and social criteria. And certainly on the social front, diversity and equity and inclusion, so pay equity, all those factors are going to be part of it. And then I would say last but not least is that it increasingly matters to lenders and investors, and showing that you're solidly on top of diversity, equity, and inclusion increases your bankability, because all the data is coming out to show that those companies are more robust.
Yeah, it's
So,
great. And well,
yeah.
sorry.
I was just going to say, not only the right thing to do, like there's definitely clear business advantages backed up by data.
Yeah, and it's great to see some of that data starting to come out now, because it's really helping. You know, you used to hear of the triple bottom line, but now it seems there's a real merit and real metric to some of these initiatives, and especially in DEI and the ESG space as well. You hear it in climate as well, and investment.
Agree.
Yeah. So the minister, you know, just I think this has to be our last question. Unfortunately, it's been a great discussion so far. But the minister spoke of a mixed record in the business community, and he, you know, he didn't balk from saying there's more to be done. So just thinking about that for a moment, as you think about Canadian business owners, and you know, small and medium enterprise, they've got a lot of things, a lot of plates spinning. In your view, what's holding them back from evolving or taking that next step, evolving their approach or taking that next step on diversity, equity, and inclusion?
You know, honestly, when we speak to our clients and when we survey them, oftentimes what we hear is that they don't feel like they have enough time, money, or knowledge to really tackle this. What we find though is they don't realize that in many cases they're already doing some of it without thinking about it this way. So, you know, for example, there's a lot of stuff that people are already doing that they could ramp up that would actually, you know, put them ahead, and they don't need to be held back from the fear of doing the wrong thing, or gosh, this seems like a really big thing to tackle. I mean, they need to be authentic and transparent about it, but there are a few things that they're already doing or that they could do a little bit more of. And if I could take a second, I mean, I'd love to just tell you like the things I think that are not that difficult to get started on.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things I would say is actually talk to your employees. So, you know, employee feedback has been essential for BDC. Annual, obviously, it depends how many employees you have, whether you need to do a big survey or whether it's a matter of sitting around the table with coffee and having frank discussions about how you're doing or how people feel about, you know, how things are going. If you have a trusted environment to do that. I think that a really big one is adjusting how you screen and search for candidates. You know, a really transformational thing is really just aim for a diverse slate of candidates on your shortlist. You still want to hire the best people for the job, of course, but at least make sure that, you know, when you get your shortlist down to the top, I'm making this up, but the top 6 or whatever, are they reasonably diverse so that you're actually going to do the deeper dive with a wide range of people? Some companies are even doing things like hiding the names and of the applicants on CVs, because in effect that helps to mask gender and often ethnicity, which can also get rid of some unconscious bias. So you can do a lot just by the hiring. Another relatively easy one is you can do team training and learning on diversity and inclusion. So for example, at BDC, we have mandatory unconscious bias training. And by the way, no matter who you are, trust me, you have unconscious bias. There's a really interesting Harvard online tool to check your own unconscious bias. But we offer anti-racism training and a course called 4 Seasons of Reconciliation, which is about understanding Indigenous reconciliation, and we offer it for free to all Canadian entrepreneurs. So that's something that can even be a bit of a fun thing for a team to do. And another one is recognizing the holidays and cultures of your employees. You know, I'm thinking about a company where I worked and where we had annual potluck, like international potluck, where people were invited to bring you know, a favorite dish that was traditional in their family or in their culture. So there's a lot of little things you can do to, I mean, these are very small, but sometimes very effective ways to make people feel included. And you'd be surprised at how many people would say, oh, I'm not doing enough on D&I. And when they think about it that way, maybe they are doing some of those things and they could just ramp them up a little.
Well, that's a great point. And you know, it's never, the barrier doesn't have to be that big. It doesn't have to be a whole system change immediately overnight for a business. It can be these meaningful but attainable small measures, small beginnings that begin that pathway or open up those other doors. So thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much, Sandra. I wish we could go on longer. I think there's a lot more to unpack here, and it's been great. So great for me, great for our audience. So I just want to recognize Sandra Odendahl, the Senior Vice President of and the Head of Sustainability and Diversity with BDC. Thank you so much, Sandra, for joining us.
Thanks,
today.
Matthew. It was a pleasure.
So before we move on to our next session, the morning's panel discussion, I'd like to just remind everyone we're going to take 10 minutes. We had that short interruption earlier with the technology. And so we're going to have just a 10-minute health break right now. Grab a cup of coffee, stretch your legs, do a couple of yoga poses, and we'll be right back at, say, 11:26. So thanks again to Sandra Odendahl with the BDC. My name is Matthew Holmes, and we'll see you back here in 10 minutes. Thanks again.